Imagine discovering that one of the world's most beloved dogs exists because of a secret hidden in a handwritten notebook for more than a century. Today, millions of families know the Golden Retriever as the perfect companion. They're trusted therapy dogs, loyal family pets, search and rescue partners, and familiar faces in movies, parks, and homes around the world. Their gentle temperament feels so natural that most people never stop to ask a simple question: where did a dog like this come from? The answer turns out to be far more surprising than most people realize. To find it, we have to travel back to 19th century Scotland. Picture a landscape of rolling green hills, winding rivers, dense forests, and endless stretches of rugged countryside. Mist drifted across the highlands. Rain swept through valleys. On vast hunting estates, wealthy landowners spent long days pursuing game birds across some of the most challenging terrain in Britain, and success depended heavily on the dogs beside them. When a bird fell hundreds of yards away into thick brush, marshland, or rough woodland, retrieving it was no simple task. Hunters needed dogs that could think independently, follow commands precisely, navigate difficult terrain, and return game without damaging it. Many breeds possessed some of those qualities. None seemed to possess all of them. One man became particularly fascinated by that problem. His name was Sir Dudley Marjoribanks. While others accepted the limitations of existing hunting dogs, Marjoribanks wondered whether something better could be created. He envisioned a retriever with intelligence, endurance, trainability, and an unusually gentle disposition. A dog capable of excelling in the field while remaining calm and cooperative around people. At first, that might not sound revolutionary, but creating an entirely new breed was an enormous undertaking. It required years of observation, experimentation, patience, and an understanding of canine behavior that few people possessed. Yet, Marjoribanks was determined to try. Behind the walls of his Scottish estate, a quiet breeding program began to take shape. Over time, distinctive golden-colored dogs started appearing. People noticed them. Breeders became curious. Stories spread. And that's where the mystery began. Rumors soon circulated across Britain about where these remarkable dogs had come from. One of the most popular stories claimed they descended from rare Russian circus dogs purchased during a traveling performance. Others insisted they originated from exotic European bloodlines that had somehow disappeared from history. The stories were fascinating. The problem was that nobody could prove them. Marjoribanks offered little public explanation. Reliable records seemed non-existent. In the absence of evidence, speculation flourished. Newspapers repeated the claims. Breeders argued over them. Dog enthusiasts defended competing theories for decades. Eventually, the rumors became so widespread that many people simply accepted them as fact, and for years, the truth remained hidden. Then, something unexpected happened. Long after Marjoribanks's death, researchers uncovered a collection of handwritten breeding records that had survived the passage of time. Inside were detailed notes, pedigrees, dates, and observations recorded with remarkable care. Suddenly, historians no longer had to rely on rumors. For the first time, they could follow the breed's story step by step. What they discovered dismantled decades of myths almost overnight. The famous Russian circus dog story, unsupported. The mysterious, lost bloodlines, largely fiction. The real story was hiding in those pages all along, and this is what most people don't realize. The history of the Golden Retriever can be traced back to a single yellow-colored puppy, born at a time when dogs of that color were often overlooked and sometimes considered undesirable. Think about that for a moment. One puppy, one puppy sound, one unexpected decision, and a chain of events that would eventually lead to one of the most loved dog breeds on Earth. But who was that puppy? Why was its color so unusual? And how did a dog that almost nobody wanted become the foundation of a breed cherished by millions today? The answer begins with a chance birth that changed canine history forever. In 1864, something unremarkable happened on a Scottish estate. A litter of wavy-coated retrievers was born, exactly as expected. Healthy, ordinary. the kind of dogs that would normally disappear into history without a second thought. But one puppy didn't fit the pattern. He carried a pale yellow coat, soft, unusual, and completely out of step with what breeders of the time valued most. And in that moment, no one knew it, but this single dog would quietly become the starting point of one of the most recognizable breeds on Earth. His name was Noose. At first glance, Noose could have easily been overlooked. In 19th century Britain, black retrievers were considered the standard reliable, proven, and favored for hunting work. Anything outside that pattern was often dismissed as a flaw rather than a feature. But Sir Dudley Marjoribanks saw something else. And this is where the story begins to shift. Noose wasn't just a curious accident in a litter. He was a question, one that most breeders would have ignored, but Marjoribanks chose to follow. At the time, nobody understood genetics the way we do today. Gregor Mendel's work on inheritance was still unknown to most of Europe. There was no scientific map for traits, no clear explanation for why certain colors or behaviors appeared in one generation and vanished in the next. Breeding was observation, trial, memory, repetition, and patience more than anything else. Marjoribanks brought Noose into his estate, not as a novelty, but as the beginning of an experiment he could not fully explain, even to himself. Years passed. Carefully chosen pairings followed. Traits were watched, recorded, compared. Then, in 1868, something pivotal happened. Noose was paired with a female dog named Belle. Belle was part of a now-vanished breed known as the Tweed Water Spaniel. Once found along the border rivers of Scotland, these dogs were known for their intelligence, their quiet temperament, and their natural ability in water. They were not famous, not widespread, but they were useful in ways that mattered deeply to working hunters. From this pairing came 4 yellow puppies. On paper, it might seem like a small outcome, just another litter in a long breeding record. But within those 4 puppies was something far more significant. The first stable confirmation that Noose's unusual color wasn't a one-time accident. It could be carried forward. It could be shaped. And eventually it could define an entire lineage. Still, outside the estate, the story was already changing in a very different way. Because when people noticed these emerging golden dogs, they didn't see careful breeding records or deliberate selection. They saw mystery. One of the most popular stories claimed these dogs descended from Russian circus animals, exotic performers supposedly brought to Britain through journeys that were never clearly documented. Another version tied them to lost European bloodlines, as if they had appeared from nowhere with no human design behind them at all. The more uncertain the truth became to the public, the more dramatic the explanations grew. But inside Marjoribanks's estate there was no mystery at all. Only repetition, selection, and intent. Each generation was chosen with purpose, not for spectacle, but for temperament, endurance, intelligence, and the ability to work closely with humans in harsh conditions. What was emerging was not an accident of nature. It was construction, slow, careful, and almost invisible from the outside. And yet, as the records continued to grow, something else began to appear between the lines. Subtle notes, unusual pairings, decisions that didn't quite fit the simple story people would later believe, and it raised a question that no one at the time could fully answer. Was this breed being created or carefully assembled into something far more deliberate than history ever realized? And the next chapter of the records would push that question even further. By the late 1860s, something had changed on Sir Dudley Marjoribanks's estate in Scotland. What began with a single unusual puppy had quietly become something far more deliberate. This was no longer just breeding. It was selection, observation, refinement across generations. And yet, strangely, almost everything we know about it comes from records that never fully explain why it was happening in the first place. The 4 yellow puppies from Noose and Belle became the foundation of a developing line, but they were not treated as a single result. They were treated as possibilities. Each one was watched closely, how they moved, how they responded to commands, how they behaved under pressure. Some were kept for further breeding. Others were removed from the core program and placed into working roles elsewhere on hunting estates. Nothing unusual for the time, and yet the precision of it feels different in hindsight, because one goal begins to stand out across the records: water. Not just the ability to swim, but to work in it. The Scottish landscape demanded dogs that could move through freezing rivers, flooded fields, and dense marshes where game birds often disappeared out of sight. A successful retriever had to do more than survive those conditions. It had to stay focused inside them. So additional water-working breeds were introduced into the program. Dogs linked to the now-vanished Tweed Water Spaniel, other retriever lines known for endurance in wet terrain. Each addition was chosen carefully, not to overwhelm the line, but to strengthen what was already emerging. But then something subtle begins to appear in the records. It isn't a trait that can be measured easily. It's behavior. Across multiple generations, observers begin describing the same unusual pattern. These dogs don't rush in the field the way others do. They don't break focus. They don't act on impulse. They wait. They watch their handlers closely, almost too closely, responding not just to commands, but to the smallest shifts in posture, gesture, intention. In modern terms, we might describe it as advanced social intelligence. But in the 19th century, there was no language for that. So they called it something simpler: steadiness. And if you imagine it, the scene becomes almost unreal. A fog rolling across a Scottish field, visibility dropping to almost nothing, a hunter lifting a hand slightly, no words, no whistle, and a dog already moving in perfect understanding of what's needed. Not guessing, responding. That detail alone begins to separate these dogs from anything else recorded at the time. Later accounts, including those associated with John Henry Walsh writing under the name Stonehenge, one of the most respected voices in sporting dog literature, describe retrievers with remarkably similar traits emerging during this period. Independent observations that seem to echo what was happening on the estate. Still, one question lingers beneath all of this. Why was temperament becoming so important? Most breeders of the era focused on appearance, size, or raw hunting efficiency, traits that were visible, measurable, immediate. But here, something less visible was being prioritized: calmness, patience, responsiveness, control under pressure. And that raises a question the records never directly answer. Was this simply about creating a better hunting dog, or something closer to a companion that could understand humans in a different way entirely? Because as the 1870s approached, something began to shift. The dogs didn't just improve, they started to feel consistent in a way that others weren't, as if a line was being drawn generation by generation towards something more stable, more predictable, and more connected to the people guiding them. And whatever was taking shape inside those records was about to move beyond the estate itself. By the 1870s, something was changing inside the kennels at Sir Dudley Marjoribanks's estate in Scotland. But it wasn't sudden, and that's what made it so difficult to notice at first. A puppy pauses a second longer before chasing a thrown object. Another stays slightly closer to its handler instead of drifting into open ground. A retriever returns a little more gently than expected, careful, controlled, almost deliberate in how it delivers what it was sent to find. Individually, none of this meant much. But across litters, across years, across generations, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Sir Dudley did not miss it. He recorded everything. And those records reveal a quiet but unmistakable shift. These dogs were becoming less defined by independent instinct and more defined by human connection. In the field, that mattered immediately. A hunting dog that hesitates too long is inefficient. A hunting dog that ignores direction is useless. But a hunting dog that waits, watches, and responds with precision, that changes everything. Modern science would later describe this as selection for trainability and social responsiveness, traits that shape how animals interpret and react to human cues. But in the 19th century, there was no such language. There was only experience, and handlers began calling it something far simpler: good manners. Still, something about it didn't behave like ordinary variation, because these changes didn't spread slowly over centuries. They appeared within a surprisingly short span of generations. Stable, repeated, consistent, as if the dogs were being drawn toward a specific behavioral design. Later thinkers, including those influenced by Charles Darwin's work on domestication, would argue that repeated selection pressures can reshape not only physical traits, but behavior itself, especially when those pressures are consistent and deliberate. And from that perspective, what was happening in Scotland becomes something far more concentrated than normal evolution. But even that explanation leaves something unresolved, because the most striking change wasn't just in how the dogs worked. It was in how they related. Why did they begin to stay close to humans even when they weren't being asked to work? Why did they follow without command, remain attentive without reward, and respond to subtle gestures that other dogs would ignore? Some explanations point to intent, a practical goal, softer mouths, calmer temperaments, dogs that could retrieve without damaging game and remain controllable in the field. That alone would have shaped behavior significantly over time. But there's another possibility that emerges from the records more quietly, a convergence of lines. Retrievers, water spaniels, now lost regional working dogs, each contributing something slightly different. And in rare cases like this, traits don't just add together. They interact. They amplify. Inside the estate, gamekeepers began to notice something that didn't quite fit the old categories of working dog. These animals didn't just obey, they stayed. Even when no work was being done, they remained close to people, attentive to movement, sensitive to presence in a way that felt less like training and more like attachment. Later sporting accounts would describe it carefully, almost cautiously, a devotion that went beyond utility. And that phrase changes the meaning of everything that came before it, because at that point, the dog is no longer defined only by what it can do. It is beginning to be defined by what it chooses to be near. By the end of the 1870s, the dogs from Guisachan were no longer just refined retrievers. They were something closer to a new category entirely, one where performance in the field and emotional alignment with humans were no longer separate goals, but part of the same design. And once that line begins to blur, the idea of a working animal starts to quietly transform into something else entirely, something that history was not quite ready to name. By the 1880s, something had begun to change around Guisachan. It was no longer just an estate breeding dogs in quiet isolation. People were noticing. Hunters who visited left with stories. Neighbors talked. Word began to spread through sporting circles across Britain that something unusual was emerging from the Scottish Highlands. But it wasn't immediately obvious what made these dogs different. At first glance, they still looked like retrievers. It was the behavior that stood out. These yellow dogs didn't rush forward with the same restless drive seen in many working breeds. They didn't scatter or push ahead blindly into terrain. Instead, they paused. They watched their handlers closely, and when they moved, it felt measured, almost deliberate, as if every action was waiting for confirmation rather than impulse. In a time when hunting dogs were valued for speed, aggression, and independence, this kind of restraint felt almost unfamiliar. And that unfamiliarity is exactly what made people pay attention. Sir Dudley Marjoribanks continued refining his breeding program, but the direction was already becoming visible beyond the estate walls. What had once been a private experiment was now entering a wider world of sporting reputation. Then, in 1894, everything shifted. Sir Dudley passed away, but the dogs did not disappear with him. The breeding line continued through his successors, carried forward quietly through careful management and growing interest from sporting communities who had begun to recognize their consistency and unusual temperament. And around the same time, something else was happening. The world of dog breeding itself was changing. The Kennel Club, established in 1873, was beginning to bring structure to what had once been an informal and highly personal world of breeding and exhibition. Dogs were now being evaluated not only on working ability, but on type, appearance, and consistency across generations. For the first time, classification was becoming formal, and when the yellow retrievers from Guisachan began appearing in early shows and field trials, They stood out immediately. Their coats ranged from pale cream to deep gold, catching attention in a world dominated by darker retriever types. But judges and observers didn't stop at color. They noticed something harder to define: balance, composure, a steady attentiveness that carried through even in unfamiliar environments. Some early records describe their expression in careful terms, but repeatedly returned to the same impression: a calmness that felt unusually consistent across individuals. Not dramatic, not aggressive, just steady. As interest grew, so did disagreement. Some breeders insisted these dogs were simply variations within existing retriever lines, nothing more than color differences within known types. Others began to argue something different, that what they were seeing was not variation at all, but the emergence of a distinct and stable type. But without genetic science to settle the question, classification depended entirely on observation and interpretation. And interpretation is never neutral. Behind the public debate, the breeding program itself continued to stabilize. Selection favored consistency in coat, steadiness in temperament, and reliable responsiveness to human direction. Over time, what had once appeared as unusual traits became repeated, then expected, then defining. A pattern was forming, and once a pattern becomes consistent enough, it stops looking like variation. It starts looking like identity. Still, not everyone agreed on what that identity meant, because if these dogs were truly something new, then they needed to be named, classified, and separated from everything that came before. But if they weren't, then they were simply a refined version of something already known. And that disagreement didn't just shape opinions. It shaped the future of the breed itself, because now the question was no longer just about how these dogs behaved. It was about what they were allowed to become, and that question was about to push the golden retriever from regional curiosity into official recognition, and into the final stage of becoming a breed the world would never stop recognizing. By the early 1900s, the disagreement over the yellow retrievers had moved far beyond casual debate. It had become something more structured, more formal, and far more consequential. Inside the world of British dog breeding, opinions were splitting into two clear directions. Traditional retriever breeders believed only long-established lines deserved recognition. To them, these dogs were still just variations, different shades of an existing type, shaped by preference rather than biology. But others saw something harder to dismiss: a line of dogs that kept producing the same behavioral consistency across generations: calmness, responsiveness, a steady, almost effortless cooperation with humans. And neither side was willing to back down. But while people argued, the dogs continued to evolve. And that's where things became complicated, because real populations don't behave like categories. Within the same litters, differences persisted. Some dogs were larger, more driven in the field. Others were softer in temperament, more focused on human proximity. Coat shades ranged from pale cream to deeper gold. The result wasn't uniformity. It was variation held inside a pattern. And that made classification difficult at exactly the moment when Britain was trying to make classification strict. Kennel organizations were formalizing rules. Registries were being created. Standards were being written down for the first time. Everything was being sorted into defined boxes. But these dogs resisted easy placement. Still, change was coming. In 1913, the emerging line received provisional recognition in Britain under the name Retriever, Golden, and Yellow. It wasn't the final identity, but it was a turning point. For the first time, official bodies were acknowledging that this wasn't just a color variation within existing retrievers. It was something consistent enough to stand apart. Even then, agreement was fragile. Some breeders insisted this was nothing more than aesthetic preference, a fashionable interpretation of familiar dogs. Others pointed to something harder to ignore: the stability of temperament across generations, the repeated calmness, the predictability of behavior under pressure. And in that disagreement lies something deeper than dogs. It reflects a question humans have always struggled with: when does variation become identity? Modern evolutionary biology would later describe the answer in simple terms: variation in nature is continuous. The boundaries are not. They are drawn by people, through observation, consensus, and sometimes convenience. But in the early 1900s, that idea was still taking shape. Meanwhile, something else was happening outside the breeding debates. The dogs themselves were leaving the field and entering the home. No longer valued only for retrieving game, they were increasingly kept as companions, not just by hunters, but by families, urban households, and the rising middle class. And with that shift, everything about how they were perceived began to change. A steady working trait became calmness. A controlled response became gentleness. A reliable temperament became loyalty. Early photographs from this period capture the transformation clearly. Golden retrievers sitting quietly beside children, resting indoors near fireplaces, walking closely beside their owners, not as tools of work, but as members of daily life. Something had changed in the relationship between humans and these dogs. Not suddenly, but irreversibly. And that change reflected something larger happening in society itself. Industrialization, urban life, a growing need for emotional stability inside increasingly structured human environments. In that world, the role of certain animals began to shift, not just in function, but in meaning. Still, one final step remained before everything became official. The scattered names, the regional descriptions, the competing classifications. All of it needed to be unified, and that required recognition from the highest levels of kennel authority. In 1990, that moment finally arrived. A formal identity was established, a name that would replace uncertainty with definition. And once spoken into the record, it would travel far beyond Britain, carrying this breed from debated origin into global recognition. But with a name comes something else, a fixed place in history. And what gets fixed in history is often only the beginning of what the world later assumes was always true. By 1909, something long in motion finally settled into place. What had once been scattered across records, estates, and informal descriptions was now being pulled into a single official identity. In breeding catalogs, kennel discussions, and early registration documents, a name began to appear with increasing consistency. Golden Retriever. Simple, clean, almost inevitable in hindsight. But at the time, it marked a decisive shift in how these dogs were understood, not just by breeders, but by the entire structure of organized canine classification in Britain. This was no longer just a descriptive label. It was recognition, and recognition has consequences. With formal acceptance came structure. Organizations like the Kennel Club in Britain began defining what this breed should look like and how it should behave. Coat ranges were described more precisely. Body proportions were standardized. Temperament, once an observed trait, was now part of the official definition. In other words, decades of lived breeding history were being translated into rules. And once rules exist, they begin to shape the future more than the past. Certain traits rose to the center of that definition. The soft mouth essential for retrieving game without damage. The steady temperament calm under pressure, responsive under instruction. The cooperative nature that had once set these dogs apart in the field. What had once been observed was now required. Writers of the period helped reinforce this new identity. Figures such as Edward Cecil Ashe, writing in early 20th century canine literature, described retrievers in ways that spread beyond hunting circles and into a wider public imagination. The Golden Retriever was no longer just a working dog. It was becoming a cultural image. But something larger was happening outside the world of breed standards. The world itself was changing. And in the years after the First World War, Europe was marked by loss, rebuilding, and a quiet search for stability. Cities expanded, families shifted, life inside the home began to take on a deeper emotional role than before. And in that environment, something about the Golden Retriever fit almost too naturally. Not distant, not aggressive, not difficult to read, just present. A calm presence moving through increasingly complex human lives. Photographs from this period capture that shift with striking clarity. Golden retrievers sitting beside children in quiet rooms, resting indoors near fireplaces, walking closely with their owners not as tools of work but as part of daily life itself. The field was no longer their only place. The home had become their world. And as that world expanded, so did the meaning of the breed. Traits that were once described in practical terms began to take on emotional language. Steadiness became loyalty. Responsiveness became devotion. Calmness became gentleness. But here's where things become more interesting. Because once a breed moves into human homes at scale, something subtle begins to happen. It is no longer shaped only by breeders selecting traits in kennels. It is shaped by daily life, by children reaching out, by families rewarding behavior they find comforting, by generations of humans quietly reinforcing what they want the animal to become. In that sense, the golden retriever was no longer being shaped in one place. It was being shaped everywhere. And that raises a question that sits beneath the entire story. Was this breed carefully designed over decades of intentional selection, or gradually refined by the emotional needs of the people who came to love it? By the 1920s, the answer no longer belonged only to history. It belonged to millions of homes. And the identity of the golden retriever was no longer just something recorded in stud books or kennel archives. It was something lived, something shared, something constantly being rewritten in real time by the bond between humans and dogs. And as that bond deepened across the world, one final stage remained. The moment when this breed would stop being emerging history and become something the entire world would simply recognize as familiar. That moment is where the story concludes. By the middle of the 20th century, the golden retriever had moved far beyond the world it was originally built in. No longer confined to Scottish estates or defined only by hunting tradition, it had become something much larger, a presence in homes, across Britain, across North America, and soon across much of the world. But this wasn't just a story of geographic spread. It was a story of transformation. It's inside homes. The golden retriever was no longer seen primarily as a working animal. It had become something closer to a constant companion, an emotional stabilizer in a world that was itself changing rapidly. And as that role expanded, something subtle began to happen. The breed did not remain unchanged, because selection was no longer happening only in kennels. It was happening in living rooms, in backyards, in daily routines shared between humans and animals. People began to favor certain behaviors more than others. A dog that remained calm around children was kept. A dog that tolerated noise, movement, and unpredictability was bred forward. A dog that responded gently to strangers became the ideal. And over time, those preferences became invisible forces shaping the breed itself. Modern behavioral science offers a way to understand this. Early ethologists like Konrad Lorenz helped reveal that domesticated animals are not shaped by genetics alone. They are shaped by repeated interaction, by the environments they live in, and the responses those environments reward. In practice, that looks simple. A child reaches out. A household fills with sound and activity. A visitor walks through the door, and the dog responds, not with aggression or withdrawal, but with calm attention, restraint, and steady awareness. What appears to be pure temperament is actually the result of long-term reinforcement layered across generations. Not just biology, but lived experience. And once that cycle begins, it reinforces itself. The more people see golden retrievers as gentle and stable, the more they choose dogs that display those traits. The more those dogs are chosen, the more those traits dominate the population. Expectation becomes selection. Selection becomes identity. And identity becomes expectation again. A loop forms that no single breeder fully controls. By the mid-century, this loop had extended beyond homes and into culture itself. Photographs, advertisements, and early television began to consistently show golden retrievers in domestic settings, resting beside children, sitting calmly in living rooms, walking peacefully alongside families. Each image reinforced the same idea. This is what a family dog looks like. And as that image spread, it reshaped demand, which in turn reshaped breeding, which reinforced the image again. But alongside this growing cultural identity, researchers and veterinarians began noticing something else, a deeper sensitivity. Golden retrievers didn't just behave well. They responded to emotional atmosphere, a change in tone, a shift in mood, a quiet tension in a room. They seemed to register it and adjust, not dramatically, but subtly. This quality would later become central to their role in therapy work and assistance settings, long before those categories even formally existed. And in a strange way, it loops all the way back to their origins. Because from the beginning, selection had emphasized cooperation, steadiness, and close responsiveness to humans in the field. What started as a practical requirement for retrieving game without damage slowly evolved into something broader, a sensitivity to human direction, then human presence, then human emotion. But as the breed became more defined in public understanding, a question began to surface among historians and genetic researchers. How much of what we now recognize as the Golden Retriever comes from its original 19th century foundation, and how much has been shaped by a century of human expectation layered on top of it? Because once a breed lives inside human culture at scale, it is no longer shaped in isolation. It is shaped in response to us. And that makes the distinction between created and influenced far less clear than it first appears. And just as that idea began to settle into accepted history, new genetic studies began reopening older questions about the breed's earliest foundation, questions suggesting that even the origin story, thought to be stable, might still contain layers we have not fully understood. By the final decades of the 20th century, the story of the Golden Retriever entered a completely new phase. For the first time, scientists were no longer relying on kennel records, handwritten breeding notes, or historical accounts. They were reading the code itself, DNA. And with it, they expected something simple, a clean genetic line, a direct continuation of the carefully documented Guisachan breeding program created under Sir Dudley Marjoribanks. At first, the results seemed to confirm exactly that, a strong founding population. A clear connection to 19th century retriever development, a story that finally looked settled. But science rarely stays settled for long. As more samples were analyzed and comparisons widened across related breeds, a more layered picture began to emerge. Golden retrievers did not come from a single isolated source. Instead, their genome carried signals from multiple retriever and spaniel-type populations, closely related lines that had interacted over time. Not a contradiction of history, but a complication of it. Because in the 19th century, breeding was not a sterile laboratory process. It was practical. Dogs were chosen for work in real conditions, fields, water, weather, and gain. And in that world, documentation mattered, but performance mattered more. Even in the carefully maintained records from Guisachan, it is unlikely that every influence, every cross, every practical decision was captured with modern precision. So what emerges from the genetic picture is not a single straight line, but something more like a river system, a main channel, clearly guided, but fed by smaller, sometimes unrecorded streams along the way. And that changes how we think about origin, because if the genetic foundation is not perfectly sealed, then the idea of a single moment of creation begins to dissolve. Still, the deeper question remains. What exactly did all this selection produce? Modern behavioral science offers one way to look at it. Researchers like Raymond Coppinger have argued that domestication is not just the selection of physical traits. It is the long-term alignment between species sharing the same environment. Dogs do not evolve in isolation from humans. They evolve with humans. And the Golden Retriever sits almost perfectly inside that idea. By the time DNA studies became widespread, the breed was already everywhere. Therapy rooms, search and rescue operations, hospitals, family homes, disaster zones, not just as a working animal, but as an emotional presence, Across all these environments, one pattern kept appearing: a consistent sensitivity to human behavior, not just intelligence in problem solving, but responsiveness to tone, gesture, mood, silence, a kind of social awareness that made the breed unusually easy to integrate into human life. And that brings the story back to its earliest foundations in Scotland. At Guisachan, selection was already favoring dogs that could work closely with people. Steadiness under pressure, gentle mouths, calm responsiveness in the field, traits that made retrieving safer, more reliable, more controlled. But over generations, those traits did not remain narrow. They expanded into temperament, then into behavior, then into something closer to emotional attunement. And this is where the uncertainty begins to deepen, because there are two ways to interpret what happened. One is straightforward. Humans intentionally selected for cooperation and calmness until those traits became dominant. The other is more subtle. That in combining multiple working lines over time, something emerged that no one explicitly designed, a behavioral balance that naturally favored closeness with humans, not just obedience, but connection. So the question becomes unavoidable. Was the golden retriever shaped deliberately into an emotionally responsive companion, or did humans gradually recognize and amplify something that was already emerging within those early combinations? And today, that question becomes even harder to answer, because once a breed spreads across millions of homes, its development no longer belongs only to breeders. It belongs to daily life, to families, to children, to repeated interactions that reward certain behaviors and discourage others. A feedback loop begins to form between expectation and behavior. People expect gentleness. They select gentleness. They reinforce gentleness, and the breed becomes gentler still, not in a single generation, but across many. And somewhere inside that loop, the line between inheritance and influence begins to blur. Because what we now recognize as the golden retriever is not just the product of 19th century breeding decisions. It is also the result of a century of human response to what those dogs became. And that leads to the final, uncomfortable realization emerging from modern research into domestication. We often think of breeds as things humans create, fixed outcomes of selection, but the deeper science suggests something more complicated. Domesticated animals are not simply made. They are continuously negotiated between biology and environment, between genetics and expectation, between what is inherited and what is shaped. And as researchers continue to study the golden retriever at the genetic and behavioral level, one question still refuses to settle into a single answer. When we say this breed is loyal, gentle, and emotionally aware, are we describing what was designed in the past, or what humans have been gradually discovering about the possibilities of companionship all along? By this point, the history of the golden retriever appears to complete a circle. A Scottish estate, a deliberate breeding program, a yellow puppy named Noose, and, over time, the rise of one of the most recognized companion animals on Earth. It feels finished. But the most important histories often only appear complete when we reach the end of the visible story, because when you step back, beyond kennel records, beyond genetics, beyond even 19th century Scotland, the golden retriever stops being just the story of a breed. It becomes part of something much older, the long, unfinished process of domestication itself. That process began thousands of years ago when early humans and wolves first moved from suspicion to proximity, then to cooperation, then to something deeper still, a shared existence. Over time, that relationship reshaped both species. Dogs became partners in survival, then workers, then companions. And in that long arc, the golden retriever represents a much later, more refined expression of the same journey. At Guisachan, selection was not limited to strength or ability in the field. It extended into something more subtle: temperament, responsiveness, steadiness under human direction. Over generations, those choices shaped a dog increasingly defined not just by what it could do, but by how closely it could align with human intention. And today, that history is no longer confined to archives. It is visible in ordinary moments. A dog sitting quietly beside a child, moving calmly through a crowded home, staying present in moments of human distress without hesitation or fear. What once began as selective breeding has become something far more integrated into daily life. Modern research in biology and behavioral science increasingly describes domestication not as a one-way act of creation, but as a continuous relationship, a feedback system between species sharing the same environment, each influencing the other, each shaping what the other becomes over time. Within that framework, the Golden Retriever is not an exception. It is a clear expression of it, not a finished product, but an ongoing result of long-term coevolution between human expectation and animal behavior. And this is where the deeper question begins to emerge, not as mythology, but as reflection. When a species is shaped over generations by what humans value most in it, where does the shaping truly begin? And where does it ever actually end? Because the evidence suggests something unsettlingly simple. It doesn't. It continues. In homes, in families, in small, repeated interactions that reinforce what this breed is understood to be. In that sense, the Golden Retriever is not only a product of history, it is a process still unfolding, refined every day, not in breeding programs, but in ordinary life. And perhaps that is the most revealing part of the entire story. That domestication was never a completed event locked in the past. It is an ongoing relationship, still being written in quiet, everyday moments between two species that learned, over time, to trust each other. And when you strip everything else away, centuries, records, theories, and names, what remains is something very simple: a shared glance, a moment of recognition. Steady, familiar, and still, after all this time, not fully explained.